As Africa's democratic future faces emerging threats with cycle of election irregularities, violence, vote buying and rigging, how do we safeguard the nation's democratic future? I mean, that's the big question. I'm delighted to have Professor Ibrahim, Senior Research Fellow of the CDD, joining us on Arise Prime Time. Glad to have you join us.
It's a pleasure.
Good. Let me start this way. What do you consider to be the greatest impediment to Africa's democracy? I have about 6 things, not exhaustive, but I just break them down. 1, sit-tight leaders, elections, leadership challenge, citizens, docility, corruption, or judiciary.
I think these are all key elements of the challenges facing African democracy. But maybe the most serious challenge is for citizens to know that democracy is in their own interest. It is for expressing their own power, and that therefore docility or apathy are attitudes that negate the powers of citizens, and that therefore in the world of democracy nobody gives it to you. You fight for it, and when you get it, you do everything in your power to make sure it is maintained, it is deepened, and it functions properly. So that consciousness of the role of ordinary citizens in maintaining our democratic system is maybe the most important one.
So I listen to you now talk about fight for it. How do you, remove this docility? How do you get the citizen to understand that they have to fight? I'm sure you're not talking about physical fight. So how do they get to understand? Whose responsibility is it to get them to understand and for it to sink in that it depends on them?
You see, the crisis of democracy in contemporary Africa is linked to the fact that citizens are not seeing the dividends of democracy. They are not seeing results. They are not seeing what they are gaining out of it. And when they don't see something they are gaining, then they start doubting the democratic system itself and begin to wonder whether, in fact, it delivers anything. But I think a democracy would always deliver at certain levels, at the level of rights, at the level of the mandate. But when it is challenged, when you have sit-tight leaders who want to confiscate people's democracy, that's the point at which citizens can now weigh the gains they have from that democracy in terms of rights and access to establishing who exercises power and who doesn't, and therefore get that consciousness that the time for struggle is always on and that they never must cease that struggle if they are to maintain their democratic system.
Now you talked about, we've talked about fight, about docility. I brought it up, the citizens being able to fight. But Peter Obi of the Labour Party, it seems to have a different view, not quite far, but he says that democracy in Nigeria is fast losing its essence as a fallout of multidimensional poverty, talking about dividends of democracy. And what democracy is supposed to achieve, which is the dividends, are not there. That's the way he's looking at it. Could that be why the docility?
No, I don't think it's a question of poverty. You have many very poor countries where their democratic systems function. So somebody could live in poverty, still believe in democratic institutions, still play their roles as citizens in sustaining that democratic system. It is true that when there is a high level of poverty, certain objective conditions are created that discourages citizens from fighting for democracy. over the past 10 years in Nigeria, for example, we have seen the spectacular rise of vote buying by politicians, where they induce citizens to give them their mandate in exchange for petty cash. And that petty cash may only be enough for one meal. And then you are giving up your power for the next 4 years for one meal that you will eat in minutes. And poverty does make that easier. But what I'm saying is, educating that citizen to come to the realization that that money I'm given, 2,000 or 5,000, that can give me only one meal and deprives me of my right to insist on the right things being done for 4 years, is a very bad transactional bargain. That as far as transactions go, that would be extremely stupid for somebody to think he's gaining something out of that process. So the point I'm making is that you can have a lot of poverty, but you can be poor and dignified. And a lot of our people are poor and dignified. And part of your dignity in a democratic society is that power you have in your vote, that mandate that you can use to determine who exercises power and who doesn't exercise power. So the point is, promote that dignity of that poor Nigerian and let him realize that the way to further build his dignity, the way to enhance his rights, the way to improve the dividends of democracy is precisely to be able to ensure that he doesn't sell his birthright as a citizen of that country.
I know a watcher there, an electorate may be watching you and saying, Ibrahim doesn't seem to understand what we're talking about. When the system, the politicians have so conducted themselves on the system in such a way that instead of 150 days for election, it seems to pay them, to buy votes, even though it's wrong, and both should be penalized. But they seem to find a way to keep the people under. So they are hungry. So instead of thinking about their power to change whoever is in power, they're thinking about, when am I going to get the next meal? How am I going to pay my children's school fees? How am I going to pay my house rent?
Yeah, these are issues people in poor societies always think about. They are serious challenges to daily life. The question on the table is, how do you start transforming that terrible situation you are in? The way to transform it is to improve the quality of governance. When you improve the quality of governance, you reduce the level of corruption in the governance process. And above all, you make governance produce more dividends in the form of public goods, in the form of health facilities, education support, etc. And all this directly contribute to improving the well-being of the people. So it's not a theoretical situation where you reflect. It is something where your capacity to struggle for the sustenance of democracy that produces direct results in terms of improved governance outcomes. And it is those outcomes that are the dividends of democracy that we are all looking for.
Let me follow you up. Let me follow up on that governance issue. In a paper recently, the conclusion was that only few countries in Africa meet the basic conditions of a democratic state. Botswana, Ghana, that just held elections the other day, smooth. Mauritius, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. Nigeria didn't feature. The paper concludes that what was missing is good governance, which you're talking about now, which is central to the performance and measurement of democracy. Two key measuring indices: the welfare of citizens, we're back there again, and the question of succession.
Well, it is true that a lot of African countries are regressing in terms of their democratic systems, that democratic gains are being eroded, and that various forms of bad governance, corruption in particular, are increasing, and that therefore it's a general challenge that have to be confronted. But in a sense, aren't all countries in Africa and indeed in the world not facing similar challenges?
Of corruption?
Yes, of corruption.
But in different in what degrees?
You saw the level of corruption during COVID in the United Kingdom, for example. It was extremely high. We are all watching the drama of the recent American elections and the type of hate that is being generated by people who have been elected to govern that country, and is therefore making governance hell for a lot of people in that country. So the point I'm really making is that, in a sense, all democracies face challenges all the time. Some democracies face greater challenges than others, and that therefore, when you put them on the scale of performance, some will do better than others. I accept that logic. But my point is, whatever situation you find yourself in your own society, in your own country, be very conscious that it is acts that you engage in that are supportive of good governance, of democracy, of transparency and accountability that will produce results in terms of improved governance. And that therefore, every citizen should see himself or herself as people who have a direct role to play in that process. And their direct role can produce dividends that are in their own interests.
We'll come back to good governance. There are still some issues there to tackle. But let's talk about judiciary corruption, which you mentioned. Atiku Abubakar, the former vice president, he's blaming, he says judiciary is the biggest threat to Nigeria's democracy. What's your sense of what he said?
I agree that, unfortunately, in this country, the spread of corruption across institutions has reached the judiciary and has had significant impact. That has influenced the role the judiciary has been playing as being the arbiters of election outcomes. In a normal context, the judiciary shouldn't have a role to play as arbiters of electoral outcomes. That's the work of the Electoral Commission. But because many politicians are conscious of the fact that the judiciary is a substantial part of the judiciary is corrupt, and that by using the money you have to influence judgments, you can get judgments in your favor, even if that outcome was not what was given to you by voters, who should be the only people who decide electoral outcomes. In that sense, I agree with Atiku's assessment that the role the judiciary is playing, the increased role they are playing in elections, is a threat to our democratic system. Because when there is a contest about outcome, the judiciary is supposed to come in as a neutral arbiter to look at the facts and make a determination that respects the truth of what happened. If, however, increasingly judges enter the fray because they have been bribed by one party and therefore give judgment in favor of that party rather than the truth, then the citizens will feel there is nothing to fight over again because the system has been damaged beyond repairs. And I think he has the right to make that point. It is something we should consider. But it is above all something the judiciary should think about seriously. How come more and more Nigerians are coming to the conclusion that the judiciary is the problem about the delivery of justice. That when you go to the judiciary, you get the opposite of justice. They should question their role, and they should, above all, begin to take measures to discipline members of the judiciary that are engaged in such corrupt practices. The fact that we know is that some judges are bribed up to $1 million in this country. Your entire life savings as a judge and your entire income as a judge is not up to that. So if you can be offered that, and all you get if you are caught red-handed is that you are sacked from the judiciary, then you are encouraged to do that. But if you know as a judge and you engage in corrupt practices that you're going to spend 20 years in jail, you're going to think twice before you allow yourself to be found in a compromising position.
I'll come back to judiciary and strengthening institutions. I'll come back to it. But let me amplify what the vice president, former vice president rather, said. He said this in relation to courts deciding candidates for elections, talking about the internal democracy of parties and winners of elections and not the people. Has the internal workings of the party totally collapsed? And how do we, should I talk about resurrecting or making it really come to bear in our democracy?
I believe one of the greatest challenges to Nigerian democracy is the lack of internal party democracy within our political parties. You know, in the construction of a democratic system, one of the most important roles is played by the political party, because that is the agency through which candidates emerge, manifestos are drawn up, and campaigns are done. So the party is a vital organ in a democracy. The party operates as a democratic agent because it is itself supposed to be based on democratic practice. When you have a situation where some people who we Nigerians call godfathers say they own the party, and this is the only country I've been in comparative politics all of my life, and what I know is that I've not heard of countries in which a politician will say, I own this party in this state, because parties are supposed to be the collective property of the entire membership. And because the entire membership owns that party, they are now supposed to play key roles in determining who gets nominated for electoral offices, who gets elected to run the affairs of the party. And when they are not happy with that, they can change them. If, therefore, you find yourself in a situation where parties themselves become the property of a few people who are godfathers, then it means the party as a democratic institution has been subverted, and therefore it's unable to play its role in a democratic society.
Or if you like, captured.
Yeah, basically captured by a few individuals. And for virtually all our parties, that's the situation we find, in which a few people basically own the party and do with it as they please. This is a country where you are going for a party convention, and you'll see the party godfathers come with the party membership cards of so-called members, collect their people, put them in a bus, give them the cards, direct them what to do. At the end of the convention, collect the cards back and dispatch them home with a few naira in their pocket. That makes nonsense of the whole process and institution of democracy.
How do we, okay, before I ask you how we change that, Atiku also talked about just what you've mentioned now, how founding models of political parties were governors, and a few wealthy individuals fund the party. A case of the one who pays the piper dictating the tune, So this will be a question of democratizing funding as against people saying I own the party, a funding model where members of the party will probably fund the party so the party can have stand on its leg.
Actually, that's a very important point. Those of us who have studied how the parties operated during the First Republic, for example, and there are a few classic studies I always encourage Nigerians to read. Richard Clark's Nigerian Political Parties and Professor Billy Doddy's Parties and Politics in Northern Nigeria. They show in these two classic works that during the First Republic, parties are funded by ordinary members. That in every ward, every week or 2 weeks, there will be a party meeting. And party members will bring usually 3 pence at that time. And that is the money that the party collects and aggregates to make sure that it functions correctly and that it's able to campaign. So there were no big men or rich men funding parties during the First Republic. And precisely because of that, party members were influential in determining who gets nominated for electoral offices and who gets elected to run party affairs, because they are committed to that party, they participate in it, they articulate their views to the parties all the time. They tell the parties what are the issues of importance for them to address in their political manifesto during election times. And because of all this, I have a feeling that these parties are actually for us. Today, we have a totally different model in which to form a party, you bring together a group of rich persons and you ask them to contribute money to launch the party. They then rent offices in, usually they are supposed to have offices in at least 18 states. So because you've paid for these offices ad initio, you come to own that party. And that's how this practice developed of busing people to party congresses and back, because you've already established that this is an institution you set up with your money for your own purpose, and that therefore it doesn't have any owners outside you, who are one of the funders of the party. That's the model we have to crack and destroy if democracy is to be entrenched in this country. And I always tell people it's not impossible.
Good.
Nigerians can begin to look at how these parties operate and start making these parties understand that if they don't show respect to ordinary members, then those members would move to other parties, which means you must begin to set up a few parties that are truly respectful of members and would allow members to make decisions for the party. Once you are able to differentiate serious parties from parties owned by godfathers, then people have a choice. The problem today is almost all the parties are very similar. So people feel they don't really have a choice among them because they are all operating in a similar fashion. That new Nigerian that will come out and start forming parties that are respectful of members would be the Nigerians that will solve the problem of the erosion of democracy in our country.
Yeah, you talked about movement to other parties. Will that solve the problem? Because the next question I was going to ask is, this picture you're painting, so laudable, how can the ordinary party member achieve it? I mean, changing the model from what you're saying. Because, again, the question of ideology of parties comes in. If you move, will that solve the problem? And which party? Some have said that APC and PDP are almost the same.
Well, yes, the question of ideology is one of the challenges facing our party system. Because, as you are aware, the Constitution stipulates that all political parties must draw their political platform, their manifesto, from Chapter 2 of the Constitution. When you read Chapter 2 of the Constitution, it is all about the responsibility of the state towards citizens. Now, it is actually strange for a constitution to tell political parties where it should source its manifesto from, but that's our situation. In spite of that, when you look at the parties of the Second Republic, and the clause in the 1979 Constitution is the same with the clause in the 1999 Constitution about how you source your manifesto. But then you could tell a clear difference in terms of the then National Party of Nigeria that was focused on housing, or the then Awolowo's party, I've forgotten the name now, that was focused on education. Action Group. Not Action Group, I'm talking more of the Second Republic.
Oh, okay.
The PRP then was focused on the
Khan.
Telakawa and all that. So you could still see there are
a semblance of ideology.
Yeah, ideological tendencies separating the party, and that therefore people had choice. But when you read the manifestos of political parties today, and given the job I do for a living, I'm one of the few people who actually read the manifestos of parties for the last election. And I was struck by how similar they are, and how they all look as if they've been written by a good consultant like me, who knows all the right things to say.
Yeah.
And I think, in a sense, and when I do talk to the parties, they tell me that actually the manifesto, they have good consultants who write them for them. And that destroys the whole idea of what a political party is. Your manifesto is supposed to flow from the concerns and interests of your members. It's not the work of a good consultant who can write what looks good on paper. And that's why when you talk to party leaders, what's really a manifesto about? Can you summarize it for me in a few words? They can't.
All right.
Because most of them haven't actually read it.
All right, we'll leave it there. We'll go on a bit, a break, and we'll return, and we'll continue from where we left off. You're still watching Arise Prime Time. Plenty more still to come. Stay with us. We're glad to have you back. You're still watching Arise Prime Time, where we offer perspectives on the news and talking points of the day. Still Ndi Amogo here with you. Well, the atmosphere within the rank and file, we're still talking democracy here and how to improve democracy. All right, I still have Ibrahim with me here of the CDD. Let's discuss more on institutions. Where do you stand on strengthening our institutions, like the INEC? The question of independence in the INEC has come into question. Are they really independent? Again, the question of he that pays the piper dictates the tune, their funding. Because what Obi says is that we must confront the question, is democracy truly addressing the needs of Nigerians? Are we building institutions that uphold accountability, justice, and fairness?
You know, one of the tragedies about Nigeria is that we set up commissions to study problems and to make great proposals, and we never end up implementing it. I was a member of the UWES Electoral Reform Committee that worked on this question in 2008, 2009, and we gave very clear recommendations. And most of those recommendations have not been implemented. On INEC, what we said was that we need to deepen the independence of INEC. And the way to deepen the independence is not to say that they shouldn't be funded by government. They should be funded by government because it's a public authority that works on behalf of citizens. But what we said is that there should be an appointment process that is not controlled by the president of the day, who will fill the place with cronies of his party as chairman, national commissioners, resident state electoral commissioners. And that they should be by open application, and that the public should be involved in that process, where you put the list of the leading contenders and invite the people to comment on, one, the character of those who are seeking to run INEC, their competence, their integrity, and that it's on the basis of that.
And their impartiality.
Of course, their impartiality, their neutrality, and that's the way to get to be part of the leadership of INEC. That process of appointment, and we gave really very detailed procedures, was simply never implemented by government. And a lot of the other recommendations we made, because we also raised the issue of the burden on INEC, that INEC does too many things. It is responsible for organizing elections. It is responsible for registering political parties and controlling political parties. It is responsible for the registration of voters. And we made the argument, every country has a system of registration of birth and death and a national ID card system. Why is it in Nigeria, every citizen must have 6 or 7 ID cards, one for driver's license, another the national whatever, the third is election. It is a waste of resources. Have one institution that registers all Nigerians, and we know from their cards their age, and from 18 they are free to vote. So we recommended remove that registration of voters from INEC, remove the registration and control of political parties and put that under a new commission for the regulation of political parties, and let INEC concentrate on its core task of running elections, of organizing elections. And its skills will improve in that regard, and we will see significant improvement. And all the other institutions involved in elections, we also discussed how they could be improved. But as is usual in our country, such recommendations are never implemented, because there will be interested parties that will see that if it is implemented, then the sorts of things they've been doing are getting away with, they will no longer be able to do. So it's a question of vested interest that prevents institutional reform in Nigeria.
From what you have said, do you see light at the end of the tunnel? From the picture you have painted now, because I mean, you're in the thick of it after presenting papers, and I'm sure resources were, I don't know whether to use the word wasted now, and nobody pays attention.
You know, since yesterday we've been having this major conference on sustaining Nigerian democracy. And the discussions we've been having since yesterday are that, first and foremost, we must never lose hope about improving Nigerian democracy. And there are concrete things we can do. And the first most important thing is for us as citizens to play a more enlightened and more engaged role in the democratic process. And the point a lot of participants were making since yesterday is that actually it was following the 2011 elections when the integrity of elections began to improve and the power of citizens became manifest. That was when politicians started bribing voters directly, meaning that they now recognize voters have power. Previously, voters didn't have power because you remember 2003 election, 2007 elections where Iwu will sit in office and just write any result he wants and declare it and that will stand. So that sort of thing was all stopped by the gradual improvements that occurred in the organization of INEC, its introduction of technology, and its improvement of the voters' role. All those helped. So when the voters' strength became manifest, the political class, they are very responsive to threats to their interests, stepped in and started bribing voters directly. Don't forget, we have it on judicial authority that when the crisis of democracy happened in the Second Republic over the Ondo elections, and the Baba-Lakin Commission of Inquiry investigated it and said, yes, a lot of money was used. They used that money to bribe the then NSO, Nigerian Security Organization. That's the organization that's been replaced by DSS. They used money to bribe officers, and then party money was used to bribe thugs to introduce violence into the Ondo elections. So money was used in that election, but it was to influence other actors that will affect the elections. Now, when the political class saw voters are beginning to see the strength of their vote, that was when they changed strategy and started bribing voters directly. And it's a very insidious threat to democracy because you then make the voting act a transactional act, and that removes the sacred character of being the mandate expressed by the citizens to make a political choice in the political system.
Of their own. Now, the National Assembly has a huge role to play through various laws and legislation. Atiku says, he gave an example. According to him, he said, even though he proposed this in all good faith and very fide, that he, just like he was saying earlier, he knew he might not be accepted. What is that? He said an example of the Turkish election, where the electoral body refused to declare Erdogan winner because he missed the threshold of 50% by 0.5%. He got 49.5%. Tinubu got 37% of all the votes cast in the last election that he won. Is this possible here in Nigeria?
Well, each electoral system has its own rules. Our electoral system doesn't have the rule of 50% plus one, which is what they have in Turkey. So therefore, you can't apply the same principle.
Yeah, he was talking about National Assembly and legislation, through legislation, tweaking these things for our democracy to improve.
Well, I think the National Assembly should definitely consider that and make the determination whether it's feasible. Because what it does mean for the electoral system is that you have to do normally 2 rounds of the elections. The first round to establish the 2 leading candidates, and then the second round to see which of them will have more votes than the other. And of course, there the question of cost will come in. So there are various considerations to make. But the fact of the matter is that given our own system, you don't need a majority to become president. And that you can therefore question the legitimacy of a president just because he didn't have 50%.
So some are arguing then, because culture comes into play, that maybe, just maybe, the parliamentary system, or considering any other kind of system instead of a presidential system. What do you think?
I used to be a very strong supporter of the parliamentary system because I like the idea of collective leadership, of cabinet government. Because when you don't have one boss who can dictate to the entire government, it becomes a more inclusive form of governance, and I liked it. But, you know, it's quite interesting that political systems change.
Evolve. Yeah.
I'm a regular reader of the British Journal of Political Science, and what they have been showing over the past 3 decades is that the parliamentary form of government in the UK has changed considerably since the time of Thatcher. That now a prime minister acts like a president, although the constitution is not presidential. But what wasn't possible 35 years ago of a prime minister sacking top ministers, for example, they do it now. Prime minister imposes conditions on the cabinet. You can't say this. You must vote in this way. And they are all forced to obey him. So the fact of the matter is that over the past 3 decades, the parliamentary system itself has become presidentialized. And there is a lot of literature. And I think those who are proposing we take the parliamentary route should maybe catch up with the literature and what's happening to that system to see whether the situation it is in today will still make it worthwhile as an alternative to the presidential system we have.
All right. Let's still discuss the question of governance. Now, there are 5 fundamental elements this paper says Nigeria fell short of. 1, accountability of public officials, how they manage funds. 2, transparency of government. Predictability of government behavior. Government should be a continuity. Openness in government dealings and effective communication. Then lastly, adherence to rule of law. And Nigeria fell short in all this, particularly the rule of law where there are no deterrents and people do whatever they want, politicians, and they seem to get away with it.
Yes, indeed. I'll agree with what you are saying, and the rule of law is indeed extremely important. And what that principle states is that nobody is above the law.
Exactly.
And the same law applies to everybody, whether you are a president or a small farmer in a village.
I'm not cutting you short. Like what happened in, I think, I've just forgotten it. So, I think it's South Korea, if I remember. So Kyung-yo, the president who he has been arrested now.
Yeah, for deciding to declare a state of emergency.
And you're wondering whether those kind of things can happen in our climes.
Very difficult for that to occur here, and it's precisely because of the significant deficit we have in terms of the application of the rule of law. And all that also has to do with the integrity of the judiciary, because it's the integrity of the judiciary that creates that respect for the rule of law. When judges are able to make judgments that are against people who consider themselves powerful, it means they are showing the entire community, not just those individuals, that they are not above the law and nobody is above the law. I think part of the tragedy in terms of governance and delivery in general is that the purpose of governance is to produce public goods that are of benefit to citizens. When, therefore, you are in government and you corner public resources for private use, it means you are ensuring those public resources will not be available to provide public goods for the citizens. And that's how gradually in the Nigerian system things started to collapse. And
for example, it took a foreign court to sentence Ibrahim.
Exactly. And they've been trying to get him sentenced within the country, and it became impossible precisely because the system has been so corrupted. So I think the question of corruption will be the most significant element I will recognize out of those 5. And the question of corruption is very simple and straightforward. You must have a system that is able to sanction and punish government officials who are corrupt. When you start sending people to jail for their corruption, others are not fools. They'll stop being corrupt because they don't want to go to jail. But if you know people have stolen billions and at the end nothing happens to them, at worst they'll negotiate with some security officials to share the loot, then they have no fear of stealing government resources in future. And others will look at it and say, oh, there's nothing to fear. Let's just do what we want. And this is a country that's designed to support and protect looters of public funds. And therefore, they can continue to loot with reckless abandon. And that's what has to stop.
That's what has to stop. The way it has to stop is another challenge that we have, because, I mean, the former President Buhari said, if we don't kill corruption, corruption will kill the nation. I mean, but let's live with this. President Jonathan, former President Jonathan, had sometime touted the idea of sharing formula and not winner takes it all, like we have now in South Africa, the coalition. I don't know how this can help our democracy.
Well, it's something that I think is very important. The first past the post electoral system we have is what encourages this winner takes all mentality. And in fact, during the work in the Electoral Reform Committee under his Lordship, Justice West, was that let's introduce a dose of proportional representation. It is when you have an electoral system that is proportional that different parties are forced to cooperate together to be able to access power, because no single party would have sufficient support to win an election on their own. So when you look at the European Union, most of the countries in the European Union are engaged in coalition politics and coalition governance, because they all have to learn to negotiate, to do joint platforms, to marry or merge or compromise in terms of their manifestos. And all this improve engagement
and dividends
of all
of democracy for the people,
sectors of society in the governance process. I therefore feel that, yes, introducing a dose of proportionality into our electoral system would be good in terms of improving its quality.
Wonderful picking your brain, Ibrahim Jibrin of the CDD. Thank you for being here.
A pleasure always.
All right, well, that's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. To join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.